If the price of silver goes to $50 or beyond and stays there for a while, then the solar industry is going to have to react accordingly. They're going to have to reduce the amount of silver that they're using. And so long term, I don't see silver as the new oil because it's just too expensive to be used as quote unquote oil.
Hello and welcome. Thanks for tuning in today. When analysts look at the amount of silver being used by the solar industry, it shows a bleak outlook for solar. At the current pace the industry is using silver, it has been estimated that the solar industry alone will use 85 to 98% of all the current global silver reserves by 2050. This trend is clearly a problem for the solar industry. If they want to ensure solar is a long-term option, they will be forced to figure out how to reduce the amount of silver it's consuming. Here to talk about the challenges facing the solar industry is the Silver Hermit. He is a market analyst and sound money advocate. Oren, welcome back, my friend.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
You bet it's always great to have you on. So, some folks have referred to silver as the new oil. Would you say this is an exaggeration? And is silver really needed in the amounts it has been used? Or could the solar industry be taking advantage of its cheap price?
Yeah, so we've been hearing this a lot, in the silver stacking community, as though silver is the new oil because it's such an important component of the solar energy industry, which is growing very rapidly. And I'm here today with some bad news. Unfortunately, I'm here with some bad news because I don't think that is the case. I don't think silver is the new oil. And today I'll try to make the case that if the price of silver rises considerably, then the solar energy industry is simply going to phase out silver and start using other metals, cheaper metals instead.
Because they haven't really been pressured into a corner yet where they have to figure out how they could replace some of this silver, if not all of it, because the price of silver has been so cheap.
Yes, this is what I'm arguing, that the only reason that the solar energy industry is using silver to such an extent is because its price is so darn cheap. And as though they don't have the economic incentive to transition to cheaper metals, such as copper, for instance. Now, I want to give you a few numbers about the solar boom. So nowadays we're seeing the solar industry growing rapidly. In 2024, 600 gigawatts worth of solar panels were installed. That's a 33% increase year over year. And in total, the total capacity across the world currently stands at 2.2 terawatts. The size of this market has crossed the $100 billion mark, with China on the lead. Currently, about 55% of all new installations are taking place in China, with the US far behind at 8.3% of installations, and India, Brazil, and Germany following China and the United States.
So that's a huge gap between China and the United States, and a 33% increase, that's massive. So when people are talking about gigawatts of solar panel right now, based on the way the panels are made today, it takes about 500,000 ounces of silver to create 1 gigawatt of solar power. And this is with the average solar panel using about 20 grams of silver.
Yes. So, according to the Silver Institute, the solar industry currently consumes 232 million ounces of silver. That's the figure from 2024. And that is 28% of the annual mine supply. So it has become this major consumer, which is driving demand and probably driving the price also. So it's no wonder that in our community, the silver stacking community, people are so bullish on solar because they're hoping it to drive the price higher.
Right, and that makes sense because if you think about it, the amount that it's gobbling up at about 25%, is that correct? I mean,
28%.
28%. That's a huge amount. And if the solar industry didn't exist, I mean, there wouldn't have been a deficit last year,
Yes.
and not by a huge factor, but there would have been a slight surplus of physical silver last year if it wasn't for that industry.
Yes. Correct. If it wasn't for the solar industry, we probably wouldn't have a physical deficit in silver as we're seeing today. But I'm going to argue in this show that silver is not vital to the solar industry. It comes in handy. It has those wonderful properties that make it very suitable for the production of solar panels. But in theory, you can transition to other metals. This is what I'm going to demonstrate today.
So why is it preferred to copper, for example, when making solar panels? Is it because it's less corrosive and more conductive, or is it there more to it than that?
Okay, so in order to explain that, I want to go through, just how solar panels work
Okay.
and how power is generated in a solar panel. Well, solar panel is based on what we call the photovoltaic effect, in which light hits a semiconductor. It excites the atoms within that semiconductor. So electrons are excited within that material. And what the semiconductor does, it has this built-in electric field which simply directs those electrons and creates a current, an electric current. And just for general knowledge, within the semiconductor, it's basically made of silicon. But you have two types of silicon there. You have a layer called the p-type, which contains tiny amounts of boron. And then you have another layer, the n-type. It contains tiny amounts of phosphorus. It changes the properties of the material, and it as though induces an internal electric field within the semiconductor, within the silicon, and it allows it to direct those electrons which are generated and create this electric current. I hope I haven't confused anybody, but that's the principle. That's the principle behind the generation of electricity within a solar panel. Now, I haven't mentioned silver, not in one word during this entire explanation.
Right. Good point.
Why is that? Because silver does not participate in the power generation. Silver is needed for the power collection, which is another problem. Because
Okay, gotcha.
in order to collect that electric current which we have just generated, we need connectors, metallic connectors, both on the front of the panel and on the back of the panel in order to create a closed circuit. Now, the problem with placing connectors on the front of the panel is that you're as though hiding or blocking some of it. You're preventing the sun from hitting the panel due to that area of the connectors which is on the front of the panels.
Right. You're just covering some of that surface, so it's reducing
Yeah,
the amount of
and
potential energy it could get.
exactly. So the professional term for it is shading. You're as though shading part of the panel. And so what you want to do is you want to create those connectors at the front. You want them to be as thin as possible. And in order to do that, you need the best conductor, which is silver. And when you're using silver, you can get those connectors, those wires, to be as thin as possible and minimize the shading.
So is this a component that you would say, even if they reduce the amount of silver that they need for these, or will they still need silver for these wires?
Right now, the technology is based on using silver for a number of reasons. Apart from being highly conductive, it's also resistant to tarnish. It adheres to the panel easily, and it tends to be stable. And that's important because you want the panel to, to last for years and years. And now we come to the question, why not use copper? Because of course, copper, when it comes to conductivity, copper is a second best. It's almost as conductive as silver, but copper has other technical problems which until today made it difficult to use with solar panels. The main problem with copper is that its atoms tend to migrate into the silicon substrate, altering its electrical properties and effectively destroying the panel. So that's a problem. Copper is not stable enough to stay, within the wire. It tends to migrate. That's one problem. It also has adhesion problems. It doesn't stick to the panel easily. You need to use another material, in order to adhere it to the panel.
To the
Has
panel.
it has stability issues, so it's more complicated to use, it's more complicated to apply, and this is why copper hasn't been used until today. And again, there wasn't an economic incentive to switch from silver to copper. Silver was cheap enough to use on a large scale, and they simply didn't bother.
Okay, gotcha. So I had read that copper is not ideal for the back contacts in solar panels because it's likely to corrode, especially in outdoor environments, which leads to reduced efficiency and longevity. Could you see a scenario where copper is used, but the panels simply won't last as long? And, they'll just sell them with shorter warranties, cut that warranty down from 25 years to like 14 years? Or do you think they might start making these panels where it's easier to get in and do maintenance on them and like replace certain parts and things like that?
Look, you need to have the panels effective. They need to be as effective as possible because this industry, this entire industry, needs to be competitive compared to other methods of power generation. So, no, I don't see a scenario in which they use copper, even though it shortens the lifespan of the panels, because that means that they are less efficient, and eventually it's going to become more expensive to install and to run them because you'll have to, I don't know, change them every, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. It's just
It'd
not
be t-
feasible.
it would be too much. So it sounds like with the back contacts, they would want to keep using silver. So you bring up an interesting
You,
point.
look, they're going to have to, if they want to use copper, they're going to have to find a way to overcome all those technical problems. Now, we don't know if it's possible or not until we research it and come up with solutions. You
I
see what
see,
I
that
mean?
makes sense.
Now, I want to go over the um, the technologies that we're using today, because there are generations within those solar panels of technologies as they try to make them more and more efficient. So
Okay.
the old technology, the old solar panels, they were called ALBSF, which stands for aluminum back surface field. And those were the old solar panels. They suffered from a phenomenon of losses in the interface between the back of the panel and the connectors, the back connectors. There were losses in that interface, limiting their efficiency to around 15 to 18%.
When they talk about efficiencies with solar panels, are they talking about the total potential energy that could come in from the sun? And they're saying that they could convert 15 to 18% of that. Is that correct?
Exactly. It's how
Okay, that's
much
what I was thinking.
how much you're able to convert, how much energy comes from the sun, and how much you're able to capture from it and turn it into electricity. So the next generation was called PERC or PERC, and that stands for passivated emitter and rear cell. And that technology improved the efficiency to around 20 to 22% using a thin aluminum oxide layer on the back of the panel. And the thing about it, it used more silver. You needed more silver in the back connectors. So that
Oh, okay.
so that was the first phase in which silver consumption increased. And then we got another generation, which was called TOPCon. And TOPCon stands for tunnel oxide passivated contact. And that further improved the efficiency to 22 to 25%. And they did that using a thin silicon dioxide layer, again on the back, trying to overcome those losses in the back of the panel. Now, again, TOPCon technology again used even more silver than PERC.
So as they increased in efficiency, they were also increasing the amount of silver they were using.
Exactly. And this is exactly how we reach this condition today in which the solar panel industry is consuming such a huge chunk of the annual mine supply of silver.
I see. And it does make you wonder if silver wasn't so cheap, wasn't being artificially held down at the price point that it is, if they would have started looking into alternatives, much sooner, or possibly just kept producing the less efficient panels.
Yes. Look, I think in this industry, the price really matters. And I'm going to give you some numbers in order to illustrate that point. Now, there is an indicator. It's called the LCOE. It's short for
Okay.
levelized cost of electricity. And it's simply a measure in order to compare between different methods of electricity production. So, for instance, the old panels, the ALBSF, their cost of electricity production was 8 to 12 cents per kilowatt. And the newer generations of solar panels had, of course, since they were more efficient, they managed to reduce the cost. So the PERC technology had 6 to 9 cents per kilowatt cost of production. And the latest generation, which is the TOPCon generation, managed to reduce that to 5 to 8 cents per kilowatt of power.
So that's a big reduction. I mean, you're looking at a third less at that point, 25% less.
Yes, but it's still more expensive than traditional methods of energy generation. Now, if you compare that to, existing coal power plants, there it costs 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt. I'm talking about the existing coal power plants, when you don't have to construct a new one. And existing nuclear power plants cost only 3 cents per kilowatt. You see what I mean?
Wow. Yeah.
So it's much cheaper, assuming that you're not constructing new plants right now. It's much cheaper to continue generating power the old-fashioned way. Now, if you look, certain articles or certain charts you will find online will claim that the cost of generation using coal or nuclear is much higher than what I've just stated. And the reason for that is that they're artificially including all sorts of carbon taxes and all sorts of schemes
Oh,
to artificially increase the cost of power production in traditional power plants. You
I
see,
see. So
yeah.
that's really misleading.
Yes, there's a lot of politics in the field of energy because they're having such difficulty reducing the cost of these renewable methods. So they started like artificially trying to inflate the price of the more traditional power plants. By the way, all the numbers I've given you is for industrial scale power plants. It's not the same cost if you generate it on your own roof. You see what I mean?
Yes, gotcha.
Generating it on your own roof will cost you a lot more than that because, large power plants, they have economies of scale.
Okay.
So the numbers I've given you are the optimistic numbers in which you are able to reduce the cost because you're
Purchasing so much at once.
yeah, you're purchasing a lot of it and you're installing a large amount all at once. And also, the cost of maintenance is reduced because you're doing it on a large scale.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So you see that solar in general is more expensive to use. And in order to remain competitive, it can't afford for the price to increase substantially. Now, when we look at the cost of the silver in those TopCon panels that I mentioned, it's
Uh-huh.
about 10 to 15% of the entire cost of the panel. The problem with that is if the price of silver jumps, let's say that, for instance, the price of silver doubles.
Okay.
That means that the entire cost saving that we've managed to achieve with that TopCon technology is lost immediately because the
It's just
panels.
wiped out.
Yes, because the panels are 10 to 15% more expensive, and the cost of generation goes up, and then suddenly it becomes equivalent to the older generation. So, what's the point of producing them in the first place? And so, what you see is that this entire industry, it's very price sensitive. On our last show, we discussed how the silver mining industry on all those copper and lead and zinc mines, as though they're insensitive to the price of silver because they mine silver as a byproduct. Well, with the solar industry, it's the other way around. They are extremely sensitive to the price.
Right, that makes sense. And then especially for these large scale projects. I mean, I could see situations where someone wants to put up a building in a remote location or a home in a really remote location where, power just isn't available, and they would cough up some money to get solar panels. But, you'd be looking at one house at a time and, they'd be paying through the nose for it. So that's really interesting that not a very big price increase, all things considered, could really make this inefficient for large scale energy production.
Yes, that's a great point, what you've just said. When you're in a remote area and you can't connect to the grid, then solar really has that advantage that it allows you to generate power, locally. And you're not reliant on a huge power station. And that's an advantage, but it also means that the power that you're generating is more expensive than if you were to connect to the grid. Now, I know it doesn't seem this way because after you've installed those solar panels, then it seems as though the power is free. But it isn't, of course,
Right.
because
Yeah,
you've had a huge expense up front.
absolutely. Or you're still paying them off potentially.
Yes, and according to figures that I've heard, it takes many years for you to get a decent return on that investment.
In certain areas out here in the States, they'll give out what they call renewable energy credits. And so if someone puts solar on their roof, well, of course, they won't be paying as much for electricity, or maybe, they completely offset um, their energy consumption. But the way the renewable energy credits work is for all the extra bleed through. So like let's say if you have a big 20 kilowatt system or something and your home's only using 15 kilowatts, well, they'll give you a little bit of money. The power company will for the extra power you're providing to the grid. And so that can help offset the cost to get into a solar panel system. But I mean, you're still looking at a long time. We're talking 10, 12, 15 years, these kind of numbers before that system will pay itself off.
There's another thing you have to take into consideration when you're receiving, government benefits or some kind of an incentive in order to install solar panel. That means that you're paying for it indirectly through your taxes or through inflation.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
There's no free lunch.
Right. Absolutely. And that is
Now,
important to remember.
Now, it's true now, some people think, oh, I'm going to get my solar panels, my solar roof, and other people are going to pay for it through their taxes because not everyone is installing them. But the day in which everyone uses those credits, then, everybody's paying for them through their added taxes through inflation.
Right, absolutely. And then my guess is that most of the different state or local governments that are doing that, once they saw that a lot of the population was installing them, they'd probably quit giving the credits out.
Yeah, something like that. Look, it's not as though the solar panel manufacturers are not aware of these problems. They are aware that silver is getting more expensive and that inflation is pushing up the prices of all commodities, but specifically the prices of the monetary metals, gold and silver. So they've already started researching options and technologies in order to reduce the amount of silver which they're using. And there are all sorts of technologies at different stages of development. For instance, there's this technology called zero bus bar. It means that instead of having those thick wires on the back in order to collect the electricity, instead they have those very thin lines. They're closer together, but they're thinner. They're able to reduce the amount of silver that they're using. There are other technologies, for instance, trying to print the silver, in thinner layers using inkjet technologies with silver nanoparticles or laser printing. That's another way to try to make the layer thinner and use less silver. And then you have what is called silver lean screen printing. They use this kind of paste with silver particles in it and some kind of a binding material. So they're trying to reduce the amount of silver in the paste. So they found that by using particles of copper and aluminum and coating them with silver, they can produce a paste which contains only 15% of the silver, and there's not a lot of efficiency reduction. So it's pretty efficient, even though they reduce the amount of silver in it by 85%. So all these technologies are being developed, but the producers, they need an economic incentive in order to implement them, in this entire market. And the incentive is, of course, it's going to be if the price of silver shoots up. For instance, if the price of silver, you know, goes to $50 or beyond and stays there for a while, then the solar industry is going to have to react accordingly. It's going to reduce the amount of silver that it's using, and perhaps it's going to take a while. Maybe it's not going to happen immediately. Maybe it's going to take a year or two or three. I don't know. But eventually, in order to stay competitive, they're going to have to reduce the amount of silver that they're using. And so, long term, I don't see silver as the new oil because it's just too expensive to be used as quote unquote oil.
So, how much silver do you think they could reduce? Like what percentage of silver do you think they could reduce out of future solar panels? More than 85% overall? Like just using the pace as an example?
They probably will continue to use some silver, but it's probably going to be a lot less than they're using today. I mean, like, even if they manage to reduce 50% of all the silver that they're using, it's going to impact the silver market. Long term, I don't see this industry relying on silver anymore. But in order to, end this discussion on a more optimistic tone, I want to say that I believe that in the future, the monetary, the investment side of this market, the investment demand for silver is going to grow so incredibly that it's going to overwhelm any reduction in industrial demand. And this was my assumption all along. I mean, like if I were relying on industrial consumption for silver, I wouldn't be so heavily invested in silver. The only reason that I'm so heavily invested in silver is because I believe that the investors will come and that investment demand will overwhelm any reduction in industrial demand. And it's just a matter of timing. It's just a matter of seeing inflation persisting, the population having to find ways to protect itself against inflation. And perhaps if we do get a recession and the Fed needs to ease once more, again, it's going to push the public towards precious metals. And I think this is eventually what's going to change the balance inside that market into a permanent deficit, into a permanent shortage of silver. And if you think about it, the investment demand for silver can grow by a lot more than 200 million ounces. There is this pent up demand out there for investments that can mitigate inflation, that can help deal with inflation. And it's the equivalent of billions of ounces, if you see what I mean.
Thank you for listening to the Silver Hermit podcast. If you like this content, please donate in the link which appears in the description below. Please subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends and family. Hit the bell icon to be notified whenever I release a new video. Remember, I'm not a licensed financial advisor. This video is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be regarded as investment advice. Before taking any investment decision, please consult with a professional financial advisor who may assess your personal investment objectives and needs.